G'day, mate. 40 here. So one of the quickest ways to get a read on an intellectual's credibility is to what extent do they pretend to know things that they don't. And so I used to live stream with a guy who was regularly opining on books and essays and ideas about which he knew absolutely nothing. And I'd point out to him, this is like bad. It's not bad for me. I don't really care. It doesn't harm me. I'm not worried about the integrity of the show. I'm not worried that you're going to pervert the course of truth, goodness, and justice in the world. All right. I just think it's a really bad indicator about you if you are frequently sounding off on books you've never read and ideas you haven't considered, essays and articles that you haven't looked at, and you're giving all these opinions about things which you know absolutely nothing. So this week I stumbled on the work of Daniel Torday, and he wrote an essay for The Atlantic, all right, on a public safety measure, and his primary criteria for whether or not this public safety measure was a good or bad idea was how did it make him feel? Now, if I were going to write an essay on a public safety measure, my primary criteria would be, does it do good or does it do more harm than good? Does it make people safer or does it make people less safe? And compared to that criteria, my feelings just don't matter for anything. But this guy's name's Daniel Torday, and I thought it was such a bizarre, completely disconnected from reality, so abstracted from reality to be perverse. Surely this guy is a gift who keeps on giving. So I put his name into Google. I wanted to see if he'd done any podcasts, and he had done a podcast. So here is the podcast. It's called Manifesto, and it's hosted by Jake Siegel, who writes for Tablet.
Welcome to Manifesto, a podcast. Your regular visit to the archives of vanity, where men and women who stop making myths turn to issuing proclamations. Your guides for this journey, my co-host.
Okay, so does you recognize that the vanity here is, coming from, in large part, from the little I heard? It sure sounds like it's coming from the hosts and the guests. But is he pretending that it's really, the truth tellers on this podcast who are going to be critiquing the vanity of others? Or is he acknowledging the vanity of the podcast host?
Phil Clyde, author of the National Book Award-winning short story collection, Redeployment. Our crack producers, Adam Camara and Alexandra Lynn of Racket Media. And today's guest, Daniel Torday, a novelist, author of The Last Flight of Poxel West, which won the National Jewish Book Award, and most recently of Boomer One, published by Picador Press. And me, the slumming angel, Jake Siegel. May you continue to be a person. Dan, pleasure to have you here.
A real pleasure to be on.
What the hell? May you continue to be... I mean, just so incredibly pretentious and pompous.
Gentlemen.
Can you tell us what we will be discussing today?
Yes. So our central text for the day is going to be one of my favorite books, The Art of Biblical Narrative by Robert Alter, though we will be straying into said Robert Alter recently completed the first ever single person translation of the entire Bible. So we'll be referencing some of his translations there, including his book of Jonah.
It's quite an accomplishment, a single person translation of the Bible. And I think it would be not only fair, but basically beyond dispute to say that Alter is the premier biblical translator really of the past at least 50 years, maybe the past century, and that he introduced a new approach to biblical translation that really is the theme and the subject of a literary approach to the Bible.
Yeah, and I will say I sort of joke, not joke, but mostly jokes that.
What's hilarious here is that these guys are talking like they know something. All right, I would like to think I put considerable effort into kind of giving you some sense of how much I believe I know about a particular topic. So these guys are talking as though they are experts in biblical Hebrew and biblical literature and the art of translation. So they are anointing who is the best Bible translator compared to all other Bible translators. What's hilarious is that I listened to about 20 minutes of this podcast, and it appears that the three blokes on this podcast have a level of knowledge of biblical Hebrew, below that of your average 5-year-old Orthodox child. But they imagine themselves to have, all sorts of expertise that they clearly don't. And it's so hilarious when you hear them trying to pronounce Hebrew that, they obviously don't know anything. Now, I know, bupkis, very, very little Hebrew either. I would like to think that when I opine on the Hebrew Bible, that I do, make it clear my own low level of expertise.
Both my first two books won the National Jewish Book Award, and I suddenly realized that I probably...
Oh, great. Thanks for letting us know, Daniel Torde. Thank you for letting us know about the awards that you won. I mean, friends of mine who've gotten into blogging, they needed to put it in the first sentence of their description was, the awards that they'd won. Right. Awards sometimes correlate with excellence. Frequently, there's no correlation with excellence. Frequently, the correlation's in a negative direction. But, this just seems to be something off and misplaced about people who the first thing they want you to know is the awards that they won.
I should pretend like I know what I'm talking about. and I've been working on...
Humble brag. I won 2 National Jewish Book Awards, but humble brag.
A book for a couple of years now that is about a false prophet. And so in going through the various Bibles, I had like a tiny bit of Hebrew, but really need to read them in English, and found it's actually kind of hard to know which one to read.
Okay, so good for him there. He's recognized he only knows a tiny little bit of Hebrew, but these guys are letting us know that the number one biblical translator in the world today is Robert Alter. Even though these guys don't know anything, have absolutely no capability of judging and pronouncing like who's the greatest, who's the 15th best biblical translator. It's
even from like an American perspective, probably one needs to read the King James. But Alter is like very aware of all the various translations, and they inform him. So in a weird way, I mean, I almost think of his new translation as a kind of like palimpsest of the last 100 years of translations.
Look, if you don't know the biblical Hebrew, you don't have any substantial basis for pronouncing on, what's a good translation and who's a good translator. It's absurd.
And then somebody just making like a series of good decisions about which ones to employ.
Yeah, I just to give the listeners maybe an idea, I thought I would give them his Psalm 23 because they're probably familiar.
For Elliot Blatt, I want some nice bloke to anoint his head, with oil and prepare a table for Elliot in the midst of his enemies.
Acknowledged heresy underlying most modern English versions of the Bible is the use of translation as a vehicle for explaining the Bible instead of representing it in another language.
Okay, so he's going to pronounce here on what's good translation and not.
And in the most egregious instances, this amounts to explaining away the Bible. And here's Psalm 23 in Alter's translation. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. In grass meadows he makes me lie down, by quiet waters guides me. My life he brings back, he leads me on pathways of justice for his name's sake. Though I walk in the vale of death's shadow, I fear no harm, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, it is they that console me. You set out a table before me in the face of my foes. You moisten my head with oil, my cup overflows. Let but goodness and kindness pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord for many long days.
Beautifully read. And, maybe one thing we should just say up front is there is this cool thing that Alter was publishing. Mm-hmm. Was publishing these books, like, as he was translating, so it took him 20 years. But I think when his Psalms came out, like, that was kind of the moment when the lay person started to say, like, holy shit, there's this whole new approach to just updating this language and making it feel fresh for you.
Yeah, and also not Christianizing it necessarily, right? So that translation, he's not referring to the soul. He's not referring to everlasting life. He's trying to understand what the authors were doing in a literary sense and putting that on the page as much as possible. He also has a wonderful book on the art of translation where he has many, many snarky things to say about other translations.
This essay,
book in the history of the world.
It's unbelievable. A literary approach to the Bible, despite being about subjects that might not seem to be, the most like geared towards sniping attacks on academic contemporaries, has 2 to 3 condescending or contemptuous, or at the very least, like withering disregard for other translators. 2 to 3 per page. It's really quite incredible.
He really hates this group called JPS, who are a bunch of Jewish scholars who made the sort of like most secular version.
Right.
Actually, I mean, a lot of people use it, but does he not like their original language?
Even when he's like, when somebody's approaching the Bible in a way that he likes, like he references Edwin Good, who talks about irony in the Old Testament. Right. So, here's somebody who is taking a literary approach to the Bible, but after, he states what Good is trying to do. One sympathizes with Good's complaints about the general indifference of his colleagues to literary issues and with the reasonableness of his declared intention, merely to make a modest start in the right direction. His book succeeds in doing that, but no more than that.
He's basically like the Thomas Carlyle of biblical withering.
Yeah, that's right. He certainly is the great man of this, and he,
Okay, that is funny. That is pretty good stuff. So these are 3 literary blokes, so they are on solid ground when they're just talking about literary quality.
You earn some right to that title, I suppose, by translating the Bible by yourself. It'll go.
Well,
a long way.
I mean, and actually, like 2 things I was thinking.
No, you don't earn anything just by translating a text. It depends on how you're contributing anything, right? The Bible has been translated hundreds of times. You translating it an additional time doesn't in and of itself, bestow any value or greatness or goodness or scholarship upon you.
Front are, first, like exactly what you just said, Jacob, which is that on some level, Phil, you really love this critic named Amy Hungerford, and she has like a great chapter in one of her books where she goes through. I was actually shocked how many people in the mid 20th century sort of like took a literary approach to the Bible, including like Frank Kermode and Bloom. And on some level, he does have a little bit of a. I think the reason why I want to talk about him here is half because he just has a different claim from having looked at this shit so closely for so long, but also. It is a manifesto. Like he is laying down a modern approach to being able to make this accessible to people who don't know Hebrew and also potentially don't give a shit. Right?
So what would you say?
Yeah, because we really need we really badly need a new translation of the Bible. Like, where would we be without Robert Alter's translation of the Bible? Like, finally, at last, 2 billion moderns finally at last have access to the Bible thanks to Robert Alter's translation. Like, who's he kidding? There are hundreds of great translations of the Bible out there. How exactly does the Robert Alter translation of the Bible, provide access to this ancient text that all these other great or decent or good or above average translations, don't provide? I'm waiting to hear how exactly is this translation, meeting some kind of need.
So the Manifesto today is a literary approach to the Bible. It is the first chapter of his book, The Art of Biblical Narrative, which is great. Wow,
yeah. I guess this is the first time in history anyone's talked about taking a literary approach to the Bible. Thank God, what a trailblazing approach. I never heard of anyone taking a literary approach to the Bible before. Wow, this just blows me away. It's like, whoa, I just want to do like a Kramer from Seinfeld.
And what would you say, Dan, is the primary claim that he is making?
Yeah, I think for me, the primary claim that he's making is that there's a way for us to update the way that we talk about the Bible in a way that comports with the way we read. He literally in the conclusion of.
Yeah, and no one's ever done this before. This is all brand new.
Of the Art of Biblical Narrative says, you might not say that this is as complicated as reading Kafka or reading Beckett or reading Joyce, but at the same time, like, maybe you could. I think he wants to say, like, you do kind of need to read the actual language. And you need to read the language translated well. And when you do, like...
you need to read the actual language translated well. Come on. There's just no comparison between a translation and the real thing. And the quality of the translation, right? When there are hundreds of translations out there, I just don't see how this Robert Alter translation, I'm waiting to hear why exactly it's so infinitely superior to the other hundreds of translations.
Actually have to be like a spiritual or theological experience. You can read it with a kind of literary mind.
Great. So we get a secularist, writing a secular translation of the Hebrew Bible, and it's going to open up whole vistas of spiritual and, theological sublimity. Can't wait.
That and for me, like, and I don't know if he says this overtly, but that like allows kind of accessibility and modernity that makes it not seem dogmatic.
Oh wow, we've got an accessible translation of the Bible. Why did anyone ever think of that before? For the first time in human history, we at last have an accessible translation of the Bible. Wow, thank God. I mean, what will they think of next? A graphic, a comic strip version of the Bible. Maybe someone will do that. I'm sure that's never been done.
But the interesting thing is that what Alter is saying is that it's not only that the literary reading of the Bible is necessary to fully appreciate its literary subtleties and its the meanings that only emerge from the prosody. I think what he's also saying is that it's necessary to fully appreciate the religious quality of it.
Yes.
And that
Why is that interesting? Why is it interesting that Robert Alter says that we need to appreciate the literary and religious quality of the Bible? Whoa! Blow me away. My God, that's such a fascinating insight, Jake Siegel. Who would have thought that a professor of Hebrew at the University of California would come out with a book saying that we should appreciate the literary and religious quality of the Bible? What a gobsmacking revelation. What an absolutely fascinating thing to say. How interesting. Why exactly is that interesting? This has been said 500 million times before by, hundreds of other scholars.
Excessively didactic approach of some religious scholars.
Oh, wow. So now we have a non-excessively didactic approach to the Bible. Whoa, that's just never been done before. That is so interesting. Why is that interesting? Right? It's literally been done thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands of times. Where is the interesting element here, mate?
As opposed to the excessively historicizing approach of some modern scholars.
Excessively historicizing. So just like moderately historicizing is no problem. Historicizing simply means you need to understand everything in its time and place and in its context, right? That just seems like an adult approach to text, to life, to history, to the present, right? It's just basic. It's just woven into any slightly sophisticated understanding of the present and of history. But why is Jake Siegel and these other blokes on this podcast just relaying pablum? Just absolute pablum, no value, nothing remotely interesting here in anything they have to say, because on this podcast, they pick off all these lofty issues. And from my slight acquaintance with the podcast, it sure feels like they have nothing to say. Right? I could come on here and do a podcast about each day about a chapter of War and Peace. But what would be the point of that unless I'm contributing something, adding something to the to the conversation that goes on down through the ages? These guys are adding nothing.
That also misses the quality, the spiritual and mysterious quality. And there's a quote, I think, that gets at this, not from the excerpt that we read, but from elsewhere in the book, where Alter writes, "As one discovers how to adjust the fine focus of those literary binoculars, the biblical tales, forceful enough to begin with, show a surprising subtlety and inventiveness of detail, and in many instances, a beautifully interwoven wholeness."
Wow, no one's ever pointed out before that there was subtlety in the Bible. Thank God, what a fascinating insight there by Robert Alter. He points out that there's both subtlety in the Bible and there's also wholeness. I'm going to go out on a limb here. Did you guys realize that the commentary of Lynn Manley consistently betrays both subtlety and wholeness? Whoa, we've got subtlety and wholeness just running wild in the chat right now. Like, someone should be doing a PhD on all the subtlety and wholeness that is just rocketing through this live stream chat. Wow.
Paradoxical truth may well be that by learning to enjoy the biblical stories more fully as stories, we shall also come to see more clearly what they mean to tell us about God, man, and the perilously momentous realm of history.
Yeah. He also says, I would prefer...
Which fully informs my own... And I should maybe at this point say, I have an Episcopalian life, and I don't frequently attend shul, but I also think about this stuff a lot. So I feel like I have this, I really like people who believe things, but I'm never sure what I believe. And there is a way in which... I think he's always contextualizing... Okay, so all of a sudden in the mid-20th century, we could say, well, maybe these books weren't all written together.
So he's always contextualizing, but without excessive historicizing. Thank God. Thank God for just moderate amounts of contextualizing, moderate but continual. Right? He's always contextualizing, but thank God he does it without excessive historicizing. Baruch Hashem.
Maybe we can even like break down the parts where some of these characters are composites or aren't historical figures. But I mean, in a way, I think the analogy for him is he's just like, yeah, but if at the moment where you're like, holy shit, like bodies are made of cells, and then you've been like, so they're not bodies. Like that was not the conclusion that biologists drew at the beginning of the 20th century, right? Like the conclusion was, okay, so now we know them and their parts, and we can know even more about them.
Right, and he makes this point that, with one of the first things that he looks at in this chapter where, so one of the things that modern biblical criticism has done is seen like, okay, like, if you look at a book of the Bible, it seems like, different parts were maybe compiled from different sources, that there might be,
Whoa, these dudes are just blowing my mind. I had no idea that different parts of the Bible were compiled by different sources. Who would have thought?
Of editors who are interjecting things or pasting things together. And
my God, you're telling me that there are editors who are interjecting things and pasting things together. Next, you guys are going to tell me that 1 + 1 = 2.
He brings up one of those points where it's in the story of Joseph, right?
Yeah.
And there's this narrative that gets inserted, right? That seems like it's kind of drawn from another source, or it's a break in the narrative where, there's kind of like modern biblical criticism that looks at it as this kind of discrete element coming from somewhere else. And what he's saying is,
yeah, because modern biblical criticism, it in and of itself, it is unitary. All right, it's just modern biblical criticism, and that's just all it is. It's just one approach. Look, modern biblical criticism contains multitudes, right? It contains hundreds of different approaches. It's not like there's just one modern biblical criticism approach to this particular text. It's like saying, well, when people speak on cell phones, they inevitably say X. Well, when people speak on cell phones, they say a million things.
Look at this as a literary work, right? And take seriously that there was a final editor, a final redactor, right, who is combining these elements deliberately, or if there's at least the possibility that that's happening. What occurs when you read this in the context of the broader narrative, and does it seem that there are sort of clear things that the final editor of this book is trying to achieve? And he makes, I think, a very persuasive.
And it's so tempting to do, these highbrow podcasts where you're pronouncing. I mean, you've got to see the different the different topics that they take on in this podcast: El Greco, Picasso, and the pleasures of ignorance, angry popes and architecture, Shulamite Firestones, the dialectic of sex. Right, all very highbrow stuff, but from the little that I've listened to this podcast, all they have to say is absolute pablum. I mean, it's wonderful to take out highbrow topics, but you should be contributing something to the stream of life, not just coming out with just pure elementary observations.
Okay, so maybe we should just go over.
It's a very complicated narrative approach. So this is going to get boring for a second, but just to sort of break down what you brought up, Phil, because this one to me feels like almost maybe one of the two most important points in like his whole over, which is that, and in fact, let me take a huge step back to say, so like he studied Hebrew and Comp Lit at Harvard. So he's like the guy, right? Like he's thinking about, okay, so like what does Hebrew sound like? And also he got those degrees in 1962.
Okay, just because you studied Hebrew and Comp Lit at Harvard, that doesn't make you the guy.
So it's like at the moment the modern Hebrew is beginning to exist. So it's actually not like he's not in a vacuum. He's saying, okay, so Hebrew's about to get way more complicated, right? For 5,000 years, people have only known like 19,000 Hebrew words, and there's about to be like a cognate for email at some point. And so like just part of what I want to say is like this project has to happen, right? The project of like modernizing what we think about it. So super briefly, so Genesis 37 is like the story we all know about Joseph getting his coat taken and his brothers all pretend to Jacob like he's been killed. And then there's just a break. And in Genesis 38, all of a sudden there's this like story that seems totally irrelevant about Judah and Tamar. And we don't have to get into the details of it, but like then in Genesis 39, he just comes straight back to Joseph. So like it does things like it's like the first cliffhanger, right? It's like building steam so that you'll get back to it.
It's the meanwhile back at the ranch approach
to
storytelling.
It's also like the first like full like juxtaposition because there's like details that you pick out in each of those chapters that match up with each other, and it's a very, very modern way to tell a story.
Right. So in the story,
yeah, the Judah, Yehuda, and Tamar story, just a very modern way to tell a story. A very modern way that communities and people and tribes have been telling story for stories for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. Very modern.
Instead of lying directly to their father, Joseph's brothers hold up like his clothing that has been that they've smeared with blood, and then the father assumes that he's been killed. Right?
Jacob. Right. Jacob sees the blood and reacts as if he's been killed.
Right. And then there's this story of.
I remember I was at this LA Press Club gathering talking to a Jew, a journalist, a bloke from England, and as he's as he's talking to me, I think I'm wearing a yarmulke. He says something like, "Have you ever heard the story of Jacob and Esau?"
Judah, right, who has 3 sons, and his son married a woman named Tamar, right, and then Judah's firstborn, displeased God, and God took his life. And then there's the story of Onan.
Which is where we get masturbation from.
Yes, patron saint of the internet.
Also modern.
So Onan is supposed to then get his brother's widow pregnant, but instead he spills his seed on the ground. That's
important because, as Alter points out, so the larger structure of this is he's taking this story of Joseph and the stories around Joseph with Tamar and Jacob and Judah and Onan, and Alter is showing the way that the full meaning of those stories only emerges from their linguistic interconnectedness, that there are these...
Yes.
Wow, who would have thought that you could only understand ancient history and stories that come out of ancient history by becoming aware of linguistic interconnectedness? I mean, these blokes have been going on for 15 and a half minutes yet, and all they have are the most mundane observations or simply repeating of what other people have to say.
Frames that are repeated and that create these complexities, layers of meaning that cannot be appreciated absent a literary reading that's attentive.
Oh, really? So people can't appreciate biblical stories unless they're aware of linguistics, unless they're aware of literary theory, unless they've taken classes in literary theory. People just can't get anything out of the Bible. Like, people have been blessed by the stories in the Bible for thousands of years, right? Before there was modern literary theory and modern linguistic study.
To, for instance, the repetition of a phrase. But the meaning that he's talking about, which...
Oh, who would have thought that there's meaning in the repetition of phrases? Well, the rabbis have been focusing on that for 2,000 years, right? This isn't some blinding insight that Robert Alter and Jake Siegel are bringing us.
Also only emerges from this the kind of, if there is a larger, let's say, sort of didactic element that threads through these stories in particular, it has to do with this idea of who's got the inheritance of the father, which runs through, obviously, the...
Yeah, if there's just one didactic, meaning teaching, element in these stories, that's it. Oh, there are dozens of didactic elements flowing through these stories. If you're looking for the didactic, all right, you can find a plethora of examples here. So I call this show, what did I call it? What the hell? The Case Against Murder, because there aren't many things that I get passionate about, where I lose my realistic approach to life. But murder is something I get passionate about. So when Daniel Torde, who's the guest on this show, does an article on public safety where his primary focus is on his feelings, all right, that does rub me the wrong way. And it does seem to betray something important about him and about these blokes on this podcast and this kind of mentality where people are, pretending to levels of wisdom and knowledge and profundity. And, these are our social betters, guys. These are the elites, right? These are the people who occupy the high grounds of culture. And all they have to offer us is pablum.
The whole Bible, the Torah, first half in particular, is continually returning to this theme of fathers and sons and inheritances and how these familial relations are worked out. And it does it in a storytelling mode, not in a purely didactic, not in a a mode that is purely literal or literally instructive.
Wow, whoever knew that the book of Genesis was composed of stories? You're blowing my mind here, Jake.
The lessons, such as they are, only exist as stories.
Well, and also just like, I mean, yes, that's super well put. And it also is.
Yeah, the lessons here only exist as stories, aside from all the rabbinic commentaries and Christian commentaries and secular commentaries upon the stories.
Like everything you just said, if you were to just decontextualize it and use that to describe like the advent of modernism, would hold. Or like it's
they throw in the jargon that adds nothing, but shows that they got this elite university education.
Exactly the way we would talk about like Chekhov's The Duel, or the way that we would talk about like Faulkner overlapping characters in the way that you have to read them against each other. There is a way in which it wants to say like everything was new again, but like this is a pretty modern mode of storytelling that you probably wouldn't expect you to find.
So yeah, they keep telling us, all right, that the Bible is such a very modern mode of storytelling, right? A very modern mode of storytelling that was composed between 2,300 and 3,500 years ago. Very modern.
Even like the middle of Genesis, right?
Right, and he points out that this is a modern conceit, right? That like we think this would only happen in like Virginia Woolf or whatever, right. But he says it's only by imposing a naive and unexamined aesthetic of our own that modern scholars are able to declare so confidently that certain parts of the ancient text could not belong with others, right? That like he's seeing these things that seem strange, that seems like odd interjections.
Yeah, so there are different scholars with different theories about the composition of the Pentateuch.
And some modern scholars are just thinking it's kind of like, they just threw a bunch of things in a text together, and then he's tracking these what seem like very obvious, deliberate parallels, and saying, no, this is.
Yeah, and he's right. All right, all the dozens of other biblical, scholarly, literary theories about these texts, right? All those other scholars are wrong, but Robert Alter, he understands the truth, right? There is this special truth out there. And Robert Alter has got it, guys.
This is a literary device. They are using sophisticated literary tools. And to sort of go back to the Tamar story, basically what happens is Judah has another son who's not yet of age, and theoretically this other son is supposed to go with Tamar. But maybe, for whatever reason, Judah doesn't want to do that. Maybe he's worried another son's going to die. She doesn't have a...
So, guys, why are you doing this podcast? Like, what are you adding to the stream of life? What are you adding to the stream of love? What are you adding to the stream of learning? Like, what are you bringing to this table here? I'm not hearing anything that you're bringing.
Track record with his children, and he sends her away. And then when his son comes of age, he still doesn't send him to Tamar. So she's just sort of stuck, right? And up until this point, she's been utterly passive, has been a passive object in the story, he says, acted upon. But then she gets up, like drapes around her face a shawl, and sits on the on the side of the road and waits for Judah, who thinks that she's a prostitute. He lays with her. She extracts like a pledge from him of his seal and cord, right? Which Alter says is kind of the equivalent of asking for all his major credit cards, right? And then she says, like, I'll give them back to you when you give me a kid as way of payment. And then he sends his man up to ask for, the prostitute, though he says like the cult prostitute is being sort of a little bit more respectful. They say, there is no cult prostitute. It turns out that...
Great. So if I was ever looking for a podcast where they recapitulate and dumb down Robert Alter, I have stumbled upon it.
Tamar is pregnant. He thinks that, so about 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. And what is more, she is with child by harlotry. And Judah said, take her out and let her be burned, right? And Alter makes the point that sort of the brutality of Judah's response in Hebrew is even stronger because it's like just 2 words. And then, of course...
So why throughout human history have societies, communities, tribes been particularly interested in the paternity of children and have had a very negative reaction against women who conceive and it's not known who the father is? Because men, by and large, are not going to stick around and take care of and support children that are not theirs, right? So from the perspectives of these, 3 wise men on this podcast, how benighted it is that throughout human history, humanity has had a very strong interest in knowing who the father is, and have had rather negative reactions to women who conceive children without knowing who the father is.
Take her out. She says, it's the person, this seal and cord, it's the person whose child it is. It turns out to be Judah. He's, and she says, please recognize, and the word is hakerna, to whom these belong, this seal and cord and staff. Judah recognized them and said, she's more in the right than I, for I did not give her to my son Selah, and he had no carnal knowledge of her again. And
the pronunciation of the Hebrew is so awful.
Alter tracks the repetition of particular verbs, that verb recognize, with the sort of showing the kid's blood drenched cloak to Jacob to suggest that Joseph had been killed, and then showing Judah's seal and cord, and that these both occur at the peak of the narrative when sort of, in one case, there's a deception, and in another case, a sort of unveiling, and that these are clearly seemed designed to be operating in parallel.
And the
then
verb itself.
The verb is repeated.
Yeah.
And then that verb comes back later with another story, not of sort of inappropriate sexuality, but this time with Joseph refraining from inappropriate sexuality, and then the recognition when he meets his brothers again. And to alter...
And also just like in terms of like, learn about that. It's also, it's like basically like a new critical close reading at a moment when new criticism was like the deal, right? Like he's using all the modern tools to give an ancient reading.
Well, modern tools that, though, he points out that in the Midrash, right?
Midrash just means the commentary on the Torah.
Right. So these things were noted more than 1,500 years ago.
No, Midrash doesn't mean commentary on the Torah. Midrash is filling in the gaps in biblical tales. So if you look at the podcast description here from this Manifesto podcast on Apple Podcasts, that lists all these prestigious books, but the way these guys are speaking, they have only the most shallow understanding of anything they're talking about, and they're adding nothing to our learning.
Right. You deceived your father with a kid. By your life, Tamar will deceive you with a kid. Right. And he says this instance may suggest that in many cases a literary student of the Bible has more to learn from traditional commentaries than from modern scholarship.
So this is where it gets, I think, especially fascinating. The whole struggle.
Okay, so this is where it gets especially fascinating. So before he related pure pablum and told us this is very interesting, but now we're about to learn what's fascinating.
Structure of Jewish learning is organized around, historically you could say this dates to the destruction of the temple, but the post-temple exilic Jewish existence certainly is organized around the system of textual commentary in large part. Of course, there's also the law and the communal aspect.
And this is fascinating. Why? Many communities do this.
Aspects of Judaism, but the reading of the Torah is not done in isolation, not only in the sense that you don't read the Torah by yourself.
Yeah, the only communities that just read a text by itself and completely bypass tradition, right, are Protestants, right? The Protestants believe that anyone can go to the Bible. Some 95 IQ midwit can go to the Bible and get the divine guidance for his life. Every other community in the world that approaches a sacred text, does it through the lens of tradition.
But you don't read the Torah alone. Like the book, so there are two versions of the Torah. There's what's called the Sefer Torah, which is the scroll, that you kind of know from the famous image of the scrolls with the cursive.
The Sefer Torah. Did you know there was the Sefer Torah? I think it means the Sefer Torah.
Handwriting that goes in the ark, and that's the sacred object. But that's the sacred object, Torah, which has its own rules. Then there's the Torah you study, which is called the Chumash, which is like the Codex, which is the printed version. And the format in which that is found classically, going back a millennium, is with commentary written into it. So the text is surrounded by the commentary, leaving aside the Talmud, which is commentary on top of commentary about the law.
I was going to say,
yeah.
If you actually were.
Yeah, so any Orthodox 5-year-old knows this. So what exactly is so fascinating?
Talk to most of the Hasidic sects that you'd find, if you went down to Crown Heights to the northern side of Eastern Parkway, they're actually spending most of their time with Talmud, in which case they're actually 4 layers deep beyond that.
And Zohar and many other texts beside. But even when I know the Hasidic Chumash, and
there's not. I know the Hasidic Chumash. There are many different Hasidic commentaries on the Torah. All right, I know the Hasidic Chumash. What an absurd thing to say. What an absurd thing to claim when you clearly, know Bupkis.
Familiar with it, and it has Rashi's commentary on the page. So you are Rashi being the acronym of the French rabbi, 11th century French rabbi, probably the most famous Torah scholar, commentator who ever lived. And Rashi, the great rabbi's commentary is on the page. So I bring this up to say that even the classical, traditional rabbinic view of the texts is not as an object so sacred it can't be engaged with. It's that the engagement comes, A, with a different set of tools, and then B, with a different set of kind of referential guides. And Alter is saying that
Look, the meaning of the tradition is the opposite of what Jake Siegel was just saying. So he was trying to make the point that Judaism's approach to text is so much more sophisticated. They don't just say, here's the Torah and it's sacred and that's it. No, they have various commentaries upon it. And so what traditional Judaism then does is it expands the realm of the sacred. So not just the Torah text is sacred, but Rashi's commentary is sacred, and Ibn Ezra's commentary is sacred, and this 2nd century commentary is sacred, and this 20th century commentary is sacred. So you're expanding the realm of that which is, in essence coming from God. So the true significance of the meaning of what he's actually talking about is actually the very opposite of what he's saying.
Meanings that you can derive only from the more traditional rabbinic readings that apply to the literary.
So the straitjacket, all right, if you want, freedom to pursue truth wherever it leads, all right, the straitjacket of the Jewish tradition is, far more complicated and has far more layers than you would have if you, say, took a Protestant approach where the only straitjacket is the biblical text itself. So this isn't necessarily, expanding the realm of the pursuit of truth, right? This is restricting the realm for the pursuit of truth by adding layer upon layer upon layer of what is sacred and coming from God, and therefore having, varying levels of binding authority.
It seems like super key, and if you'll bear with me for 1 second, because it's going to sound a tiny off topic, but it's super on topic. So I've been reading about this 17th century false messiah named Shabtai Tzvi. So I've been reading with a rabbi friend who considers himself a neo-Hasid at this kind of 18th century.
Okay, so anyone who considers himself, a neo-Hasid has absolutely nothing to do with Hasidic Judaism, right? People who actually practice, Hasidic Judaism would feel virtually nothing in common with these blokes who, there are thousands of people who consider themselves neo-Hasid, but they are as Hasidic as Northern Hobbes.
Hasidic rabbi named Reb Nachman, and it's crazy because I'll sit down and read with him, and it's I don't know about you guys, but when I'm researching for a novel, I'm reading an enormous amount of texts, and some of them very fast. I'm trying to get through Gershom Sholom's book on Shabtai Tzvi that's 1,000 pages long, and then when I get together,
yeah. So these guys are doing a lot of reading; they aren't doing very much comprehending, right? They're not exactly chewing and digesting and dwelling upon what they're reading. It's like when you're visiting a city. You want to enjoy it, you go for a hike, and then there are certain personalities who go, okay, we have to visit this beach to tick it off our list, and then okay, we got to run to catch the bus, and then we got to go here, we got to go there, so that we can say that we did it. And so these blokes talk as though, I read this book, I read this book, and I read this book, but their level of comprehension is so pitiful.
Like Josh, and he's well, let's read these 3 sentences really closely for 3 hours. And it's a really beautiful and really intense and really spiritual experience.
I know exactly what you're describing.
But I actually do think weirdly...
do you really know exactly what he's describing? Because nothing you've had to say so far provides any evidence that you know anything about this.
Alter's doing a tiny bit of a different thing. So to step back from what Phil was saying just before we lose the thread of this moment in Genesis. So Genesis 36, which is the chapter that precedes the other ones, is just one of those chapters that we all know where it's just and whoever begat whoever, and they begat whoever. So just like read a couple lines. These are the sons of Seir the Horite who had settled in the land: Lotan and Shobal and Zabeah and Anah and Dishon and Dezer and Dishon. So it's like just paragraphs of names like that. And actually, like, I think it's tacit in what Alter's saying is that, like, so it's like we get the huge broad view. Here's all the names of these people, and then the next chapter is like, okay, let's pick out the people who are most important in that. We're going to tell the story of Joseph and Jacob, and actually, like, to like go into that fractal even further. Let's take a second to talk about Judah and Tamar, and then come back out. And I would just say, like,
okay, I can't take anymore. 27 minutes we endured. Why on earth did they do a podcast on something that they know next to nothing about and have nothing to contribute? All right, let's get back to this terrific Jack Schaefer column on Rupert Murdoch. So it talks about the Trump-Fox feedback loop, right? The Fox News Network and Rupert Murdoch initially did not want Donald Trump to become president, but once Trump seized power, then they kowtowed to him because that was what was best for their bottom line. Okay, so Rupert Murdoch's fear of a Trump temper tantrum became palpable after the January 6th Capitol Hill riot. So Murdoch claims that Sean Hannity, Trump's stalwart, has been privately disgusted by Trump for weeks, but was scared to lose viewers. So this all coheres in my mind anyway. It's just that the things that people say publicly, like Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity and the Fox News Network and the things that these three blokes on this podcast on Manifesto, all the things that they're claiming publicly, like the very opposite is true. Right. So as with Fox, as with the Manifesto podcast, the extent that I've listened to it, the very opposite of what these people say is true. So Murdoch claims that Sean Hannity has been privately disgusted by Donald Trump for weeks, but is scared to lose viewers. Right. And these three blokes, they could have done a great podcast on these books, but they were scared to tell the truth. They were scared to reveal their vulnerability of their very low level of knowledge and their lack of introspection and their lack of like doing any hard thinking. And so all they do is just mindlessly repeat and dumb down insights from Robert Alter. So Rupert Murdoch was mapping his fear of losing viewers onto Sean Hannity. As a single instruction to the host to tell the truth about Trump's claims would have put things straight. Yeah, if only Sean Hannity had gotten that word. So former Fox executive told Murdoch January 8, Fox News needs a course correction on Trump. Murdoch replied, Fox News was busy pivoting. We want to make Trump a non-person. So Fox News has essentially shadow banned Donald Trump, right? They're not bringing Donald Trump on to talk. They are doing everything they can to not talk about Donald Trump and not to provide any fuel or fodder for his campaign. And what all this reveals is how weak and pathetic Fox News is. Because if Donald Trump catches fire, Fox News will have to kowtow once again simply to maintain their audience. So Rupert Murdoch was telling his son that Fox News was pivoting as fast as possible away from Donald Trump. But Rupert is aware that the deconditioning process for the audience is hairy. We have to lead our viewer, which not as easy it might seem, Rupert Murdoch says. Nobody wants Trump as an enemy, Murdoch says in a deposition, still bruised from his tiger ride. Right, we all know that Trump has a big following. If he says don't watch Fox News, maybe some don't. So the beginning of wisdom is acknowledging your own frailty, your own vulnerability, your own lack of wisdom, knowledge, and expertise. The Fox pivot away from Trump did come eventually. So Fox News, for about a year, has essentially banned Donald Trump from the network. And Trump continues to hector Fox from his social media perch at Truth Social. But he's yet to go full bore against his former ally. So who among us would preclude a reunion in 2024 with Trump pulling Murdoch's strings once more if Trump wins the presidential nomination? So Rupert Murdoch's pursuit of power and money, right, has always been a naked secret. So why does Fox News bring on stolen election crackpot Mike My Pillow Lindell on Tucker Carlson's show? Like, why allow this crackpot on the show? Well, it's not about red or blue. It's about green. It's about cashing Mike Lindell's fat checks. That's what it's all about. Okay, let's get a little here from Tucker.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight on a Friday. Last fall, a Democrat called Tony DeLuca got reelected to the Pennsylvania State House while dead. Not just dead inside, like most politicians, but actually dead, not breathing. And not only did DeLuca win after having been dead for a full month, but he won in a landslide. Tony DeLuca got more than 85% of the vote. Now, by any measure, that is embarrassing. Pennsylvania Democrats elected a dead man. They knew they were doing it. They did it anyway. This would seem to defeat the idea of representative democracy, which is that you vote for people so they can represent you. But party leaders in Pennsylvania were not embarrassed. They were proud. Quote, "Well, we're incredibly saddened by the loss of Representative Tony DeLuca," they said in a statement. "We are proud to see the voters continue to show their confidence in him and his commitment to democratic values by re-electing him posthumously." In other words, electing a guy who can't possibly represent you is not an offense against democracy. It's the essence of democracy.
Okay, so Fox News is shadow banning Donald Trump. So according to 4 Trump aides, right, the former president is now facing an unofficial ban at Fox News. The network is refusing to book him. It's refusing to talk much about him in the context of the Republican presidential primary. Right, I mean, Donald Trump running for president once again is a major news story, but Fox News doesn't want to talk about it. So Trump has not been a guest on Fox News since September. All right, Fox News skipped his trip last week to East Palestine, Ohio, right? A major talking point in the debate over the environmental disaster. So you've got, Vivek Ramaswamy, who's running for president. He's been on the network 4 times in the 10 days since he announced his run for president. Ron DeSantis, appears on Fox shows virtually every day of the week. But not Donald Trump. He's banned from Fox, where most of their audience, loves him. And their audience is eventually going to, cotton on and not be very happy. So Fox is just playing it safe. The Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity shows are just playing it safe, just doing pieces about how, did you know that Joe Biden is old and infirm? So rather than talking about, dominant news story, how credible, how likely is it that Donald Trump is going to win the Republican nomination, Fox is deforming itself, deforming its coverage of the news, to follow the whims of its Murdoch owners.
Now, it's not a typo. They put that in a press release. And actually, it makes it kind of sense when you remember that it was also in the state of Pennsylvania. The Democratic Party leaders backed a Senate candidate called John Fetterman long after he had suffered a massive stroke and could no longer talk or communicate clearly.
Okay, I've been listening to a terrific Audible series on the rise of modern Japan. So what exactly brought about Japan's surrender in August 1945?
And the United States was much less enthusiastic about working with Stalin. The United States excluded the Soviets from the Potsdam Declaration on July 26, 1945. That called for Japan's surrender. The Potsdam Declaration was issued in Truman's name for the United States, Churchill's name for the United Kingdom, and Chiang Kai-shek's name for China. Stalin was left out. And Stalin began to worry that the United States would renege on the promises made at Yalta. Furthermore, after the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Stalin realized that he would have to strike hard and fast, or Japan might surrender before Russia got all the territory it had been promised. The atomic bomb at Hiroshima demonstrated that the U.S. could obliterate Japanese cities with impunity, and it prompted Stalin to enter the war with massive force. And that confronted the Japanese government with the terrifying prospect of surrendering to the Soviet Union. The Japanese emperor had dismissed Konoe's warnings back in February, but by August they seemed prophetic. Now, thinking along those lines, the second atomic bomb at Nagasaki becomes even more problematic and much more troubling than the bomb at Hiroshima. Unlike Hiroshima, Nagasaki had little military value. And there's little evidence that Japanese leaders had fully processed the scale of the Hiroshima bombing just 3 days earlier. Nagasaki, I would argue, wasn't one of the last bombs of World War II, but one of the first bombs of the Cold War. It was a signal from Truman to Stalin not to get greedy and go beyond the territory promised at Yalta. And that will be one of the themes of this.
Yeah, so you send a signal, you nuke 100,000 Japanese to send a signal to Stalin. All right, this is how the real world works.
Of course, the Cold War began before World War II was over. Let's conclude by returning to our 4 Japanese leaders. What happened to Masaaki, Shidahara, Yoshida, and Konoe in the post-war world?
Okay.
Lecture 2. How the U.S. occupation remade Japan, 1945 to 1952.
All right, so one condition the Japanese put on is that they get to keep the emperor. But how do you keep the emperor? Like the United States just twisted itself into all sorts of pretzels here.
French tribunal. It was modeled closely on the post-war Nuremberg trials in Germany. The primary focus in Tokyo was to assign individual responsibility for a Japanese conspiracy to commit crimes against the peace.
Right, there's no international law. I mean, that's just people may buy into it or not buy into it, but who enforces? All right, if there's law that no one enforces, then the law is meaningless. So major powers enforce international law when it's in their interest to do so. And so the United States and the victors of World War II thought it was in their interest to punish the temerity of the Japanese for launching a war in the Pacific.
That meant planning or participating in a war of aggression. The idea that war itself was a war crime stemmed from the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. So at the core of the Nuremberg and Tokyo.
So by this measure, the United States has committed many war crimes. All right, the United States unnecessarily invaded Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq in 2003, Panama in 1989.
Trials was the idealistic aspiration to a world without war. The charge of conspiracy.
So they use this, piece of idealism in very, nasty, realistic ways. But the U.S. uses, very idealistic rhetoric when the United States brutally pursues its self-interest. But at least it does it under beautiful rhetoric.
It was modeled on the prosecution of officials of Nazi Germany. In that case, there had been a Nazi party and a single head of the party, Adolf Hitler, who held power from 1933 to 1945. Hitler and his aides had convened meetings where they explicitly planned a war and war crimes. In Tokyo, the prosecution argued that in Japan, too, there had been a coherent conspiracy. Starting in 1927.
Look, they're only war crimes if you have a universally acknowledged legal and moral standard. But if you don't have a universally acknowledged legal and moral standard, you don't have war crimes.
To wage an aggressive war in East Asia. Now, the problem with that legal argument was that from 1927 to 1945, Japan had been led by 16 different prime ministers. And the military was so divided that factions were murdering one another in 1936. The only single point of continuity from 1927 to 1945 was the Showa emperor. And the occupation had absolved the emperor of war guilt. So he could only be the victim of the conspiracy. He couldn't be the leader of the conspiracy. So the conspiracy charge and the exoneration of the emperor were incompatible. One American historian described a...
So America is just following its national interests, but using this nonsensical idealistic rhetoric.
Trial on conspiracy without the emperor as something like a production of Hamlet in which the director just decided to leave out the Prince of Denmark. To push a conspiracy charge without tainting the emperor, the U.S. prosecution had to manage defendants behind the scenes. They coached defendants to protect the emperor. On one occasion,
right, they coached defendants to protect the emperor and to assist the United States, executing the bad Japanese they wanted to execute.
The Japanese general Tojo Hideki testified that no Japanese military officer would act contrary to the emperor's wishes. And the prosecution had to scramble and arrange for Tojo to correct the court record the following day, insisting that contrary to the implications of his testimony the previous day, the emperor had had no part in the war effort. So overall, the Tokyo trials were like a second-tier touring company version of the Nuremberg prosecutions. In Germany, the lead U.S. prosecutor was from the top of the legal system, Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, who'd previously served as Franklin Roosevelt's Attorney General. In Tokyo, the U.S. lead prosecutor was Joseph B. Keenan, an Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department's Criminal Division. Keenan viewed Japanese defendants.
So there's a good Netflix miniseries called Tokyo Trial about this.
Through the lens of his experience targeting organized crime. Keenan had little grasp of either international politics or history, and he lacked any particular interest in war crimes. That lack of interest and lack of experience became obvious in Keenan's opening statement when he accused the conspirators of seeking to destroy democracy and its essential basis, the system of government of and by and for the people. Now, however noble that sentiment, it couldn't be seriously applied to the Pacific War, as Keenan imagined. For example, when Japan invaded Indochina in 1941, it attacked French colonies, not vibrant democracies. Such conceptual problems did not go unnoticed. The Indian judge on the trial, Radhabinod Pal, wrote a blistering dissent. He argued that the entire crimes against the peace charge was absurd and hypocritical. The Dutch and French judges also dissented.
And he was absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Keenan could have abandoned the problematic conspiracy charge and focused instead on conventional war crimes, such as Japan's execution of prisoners of war and its mistreatment of civilians. Instead, Keenan suggested dropping conventional war crimes charges. He wanted to conclude the trial sooner. Keenan was overruled by his staff, but still, the prosecution of conventional war crimes was carried out despite the lead prosecutor's lack of interest. Keenan's handling of the case was so poor that several of his associates quit. One American judge in the tribunal was so appalled that he asked to be replaced. The problem of prosecuting conventional war crimes was also complicated by Cold War concerns. For example, the U.S. secretly granted immunity to Japan's biological warfare unit in exchange for their data.
So the United States imposed a constitution on Japan that was largely a rewrite of American state and national constitutions, and MacArthur gave several blokes a week to come up with a Japanese constitution. It was written in English, then translated into Japanese, forcibly imposed on the Japanese. They were told they couldn't have an army, and the Japanese had no choice but to accept this. Then the Cold War grows more and more intense. The United States says, whoa, wait, we actually need you to develop an armed forces. And Japan very cannily said, oh, no, it's in our constitution that we're not allowed to develop armed forces. You forced us to have this in our constitution. So Japan got rich because they didn't waste money on armed forces. They just relied on the United States to spend the money.
Word spread among Japanese officers that the key to avoiding indictment was to offer some sort of anti-communist intelligence, however implausible or insubstantial. A key figure in that moral and tactical disaster was Charles A. Willoughby, General MacArthur's chief of intelligence. Willoughby was such a fanatical anti-communist that MacArthur referred to him as my pet fascist. Willoughby was a fan of both Mussolini and Francisco Franco. He was a racist and an anti-Semite. Willoughby's sole virtue seems to have been his devotion to MacArthur, which bordered on sycophancy. Willoughby helped numerous Japanese war criminals escape prosecution, including some responsible for the Bataan Death March, all in return for the promise of some kind of anti-communist intelligence. Later, the CIA found that most of his recruits were utterly useless, if not dangerous. Willoughby distinguished himself further during the Korean War. Rather than displease MacArthur, Willoughby concealed intelligence indicating that Mao Zedong would intervene in the Korean War if U.S. forces approached the Yalu River, the border separating China and Korea. He withheld that intelligence, and that contributed to a catastrophic rout of U.S. forces when the Chinese committed more than 1 million soldiers to drive the U.S. back south. Truly a distinguished military career. So with the combination of Keenan's confusion, Willoughby's fanaticism, and the dynamics of the Cold War, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal left a toxic, lasting legacy. The trial made it impossible in Japan to discuss the role of the emperor during the war because an international military tribunal had exonerated him. And perversely, the exoneration of the emperor...
Right, and you hear this all the time in the news media and public conversations. Like, oh, a tribunal ruled this. A special royal commission ruled that, or a jury decided this. Just because a jury, a court, a tribunal, a royal commission decides something doesn't mean it's true. Right? Just because things go through a bureaucratic process does not make them accurate, true, right, good, righteous, any of those things.
Emperor made men like Tojo look noble because they took the rap for the emperor. Japanese military veterans knew something was amiss. How had the emperor gone from being omnipotent to powerless? But few Japanese veterans returned home eager to talk about the horrors of war. It was easier to just stay quiet. Now that silence began to end in 1989 with the death of the Showa emperor. His death reopened the question of what had really happened. Aging Japanese veterans, many facing their own mortality, began to talk more openly about the war and what they thought they were fighting for. But those conversations are still a fraught process, full of heartfelt confessions and furious rebuttals.
Okay, that's going to do it for today.